Welcome to MaineQuality. I'm your host, Orion Breen, and with me today is Executive Director Alison Beyea of ACLU Maine. How you doing today?
I'm doing great and super happy to be here. Thank you for having us.
What would you like to get the word out about?
Oh, we're going to start with that question, huh? We're going to go right for it.
Just dive right in.
Okay, if I have my first minute to tell you what we want to get the word out about, it's probably not a surprise to your listeners, but racism is alive and well in Maine. And that the idea that somehow, we call it sort of this Maine exceptionalism, this idea that somehow issues of systemic racism and oppression don't exist here because we have a low percentage of people of color is absolutely inaccurate. And we have enormous amount of work to unpack and undo those systems of oppression that exist here in Maine, just like every other part of the country.
You have a huge national conversation going on about issues of racial justice and social justice. What work are you guys doing in Maine that touches upon that?
So the ACLU is an organization, it's a human rights organization. We work in politics, we work in government, we work in the courts, we work in the streets, and our goal is to expand the promises of our Constitution. These ideals that were set forth were actually never executed. Ideals of full equality for all people. And so our job as an organization here in Maine and around the country is to really engage that conversation with people and to try to move closer towards our goals, really, what we hope to be as a country. So how does that play out? Well, how does that affect how we work on anti-racist efforts? The ACLU works in a variety of topics. On any given day, we could be working on racial justice, we could be working on voting rights, on surveillance issues, abortion rights. So it covers a wide variety of topics. But in Maine, most of that is sort of brought together by the racism that certain communities disproportionately feel the impact of oppression by government or by programming. So that was kind of a pretty broad explanation of what it looks like. But specifically, you would see ACLU working a lot in the space of criminal legal reform. A lot of people talk about it as a criminal justice system. We really move away from that because it's our belief that there really is no justice in our criminal legal system. This, what has developed, particularly in the last 40 to 50 years, has been sort of penned in the now famous book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, is our criminal legal system has simply become a new way of sort of locking away, enslaving Black and brown people. And that's true here in Maine. People think it's not true in Maine. Our disparities in our criminal legal system are really breathtaking. Some of your listeners may have seen recently Portland released its arrest data just in the city. And they saw that while Black and people of color were about 8.5% of the population, they were a little over 16% of the arrests. So these kinds of disparities are happening in arrests. They're happening in sentencing. Who's stuck in our prisons and jails? It's a very high disproportionate percentage of people of color. It's happening in our education system. If you look at all of the schools around Maine, in every school we've looked at, and we've looked at a lot, there are disparities around kids of color being disciplined at much, much, much higher rates than white kids. So we're seeing, in the criminal legal system, we see a ton of disparities, and our work at the organization is to either work in the courts to call out and to challenge that overt discrimination, or to work in the legislature to promote bills that actually would sort of undo the racism in the criminal legal system and get more just results.
So what kind of bills would do that? How could legislative policies affect this?
Well, that's a great question. And I would have probably answered that question differently 6 weeks ago. I think what's happening in our country right now is really reminding us the importance of actually not looking for incremental reform. Bills that would just take let's fix this piece. We'll fix bail, or we'll fix fines, or we'll fix this. We really have to have a fundamental rethinking of what policing and what the criminal legal system is. And so much of that thinking is inspired by the movement for Black Lives and the amazing work that they have done for years now to start that conversation, because what we know is that white people and people of color have totally different experiences with our police. They have very different experience with our criminal legal system. So in the past, I would have told you specific bills, but I think right now what I'd ask your listeners to first and foremost think about is we have to fundamentally rethink what policing looks like in our state. And so there's a lot of talk about defunding the police or divesting and reinvesting. And all of those important language is really just about having a conversation. Why do we spend our scarce tax dollars putting it into a police system that actually only works for some people in the community? And even for those communities, does it really make them safer? We are hearing, and we know from our own internal work, but police organizations are now being more forthcoming about it. 90% of what police are responding to are mental health issues or substance use disorder. These are not public safety issues. And we have sort of put all this money into our police and asked them, to handle public health crises. So I think this moment really calls for all of us to examine how have we grown up this police state? Why did we do it? And who is it serving? And so that those conversations are, I think we all need to be having. And yes, we should be looking at policy changes that will, keep people out of jail or keep, we talk a lot about debtors' prisons, people who end up in jail because they simply can't pay to get out. We absolutely should not let that happen. But before we get caught up in that conversation too much, let's first find agreement that this isn't the system we want. That money is better served in our communities with mental health, with housing, with education. That's what's going to make us safer, and that's what's going to make us more equitable.
You do work with racial justice, with voting rights, and these other topics, and they sound like, in a way, they're very connected. They're not really separate issues.
Yeah, they're not really separate. I guess that's a nice way of saying it. I mean, they're all connected in that, it's in our ACLU of Maine mission statement. It was written actually a long time ago in the 90s, but we haven't changed it because it still so resonates. This idea that those in power tend to try to silence those without resources. And so a lot of what the ACLU is concerned with is thinking about groups of people who have been traditionally excluded from conversations, whether that's the right to vote or whether that's the right to participate in your democracy, whether that's the right to be free and not to be caged in a prison. And so all of these things are unified by this idea that we as an organization do our best to advocate for groups that have been kicked out of the mainstream, who have not been given access, and that our job is to use the law as a tool to change that conversation, to change that power dynamic.
It's a double-edged sword, right? Where the law can be oppressive and reinforce an unjust system, or we can use the law to protect the rights of individuals and create a more just society.
That's absolutely right. And I think it is a double-edged sword. And I think what's so interesting and important for white people, for people like me, running organizations and hopefully to be convincing other people to do the same, is to really take a hard look about whether we are actually perpetuating those systems, even when we think we're actually advancing equality, whether we're perpetuating them, and really be part of a movement that actually expands for everyone. A lot of people, it's not us talking about it, a lot of brilliant people have been talking about this for a long time, is this idea of, an environmental movement, we think of an environmental impact statement when we pass laws. And there's this idea of a racial impact statement. When we pass a law, what is the impact? And I know Representative Rachel Talbot Ross has been talking about this, and some other leaders in our community, but, really understanding if what we think will advance justice is actually going to fall on the other side of that sword that you talk about, and actually just reinforce a system of whiteness that basically elevates certain groups over others, even when those people are not aware of it.
So who has been contacting you? What type of groups or municipalities have been contacting you for assistance or advice in this time?
So we're getting, obviously, with the amount of phenomenal engagement in our democracy and protests, we have a lot of outreach from people talking about wanting to know their rights at a protest, their rights to speak out about their government, which is still one of the things that makes this country unique and special. So we've been working with a lot of those groups. We work with a lot of impacted folks in the immigrant community who are absolutely being devastated by the COVID pandemic and how all of the systemic racism that goes on in every system is playing out in what we're seeing in our infection rates. So we work with those communities. We're working with voting rights groups all over the state of Maine who are really working with us, and we're working with them to make sure that our elections, that everyone who wants to vote can vote and that that vote is counted. So we work with a lot of grassroots organizations. We have a wonderful group of volunteers who work with us all the time on getting the word out or responding to requests or putting in calls to try to make government do the right thing, which is always an important issue. I think that we're increasingly working, there's increasingly more and more amazing youth groups in Maine who are, this is their world. We'll be handing it over to them, hopefully sooner rather than later. And so a lot of youth groups who are doing incredible work to really bring a conversation to a new level that I don't think some of the establishment has been willing to have. So we're doing a lot of support with those groups. So it can change any day. It tends to be people who are out in the world fighting as hard as they can, and we try to support them whenever we can.
Do you do activities around the restorative justice movement at all?
So certainly anything that takes us out of the criminal legal system, we certainly support, and we have partnered with the restorative justice movement on different task forces over the years. And absolutely, much of our work at the organization is guided as well by Brian Stevenson's work in terms of really understanding the human connection between all of us. And so restorative justice is a really important part of that. Right now, the conversation, though, I think that we're hoping everyone is having is to talk about why have we said that certain things are a crime? I mean, why do we push people into a criminal justice system? Why are we punishing people? Even if it's a restorative justice model, which has its roots and history in some amazing cultural traditions and beauty, are we over-relying? Are we over-criminalizing? Are we over-inserting ourselves into people's lives? The government inserts themselves in. And I think, our concern even in those contexts is who gets arrested, so who then gets diverted to a restorative justice model. We know it is certain communities that are over-policed. We know that it is certain communities that are over-sentenced. So again, trying to have that conversation, because if there is a need for policing, and I'm not sure that is a given, it's certainly not in the way we have policed it now. That's a very tiny fraction of what's being done right now in our culture and in the state of Maine.
Where it's interesting, I think ACLU has a perception that it's this liberal organization, but a lot of the work and values, you could look at it from the libertarian perspective of protecting individuals from government overreach.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we sort of joke, there really isn't a month that goes by that ACLU doesn't make somebody angry because of some position we've taken. We do our best to be principled in those, but they are guided. You're right. I mean, a lot of our core founding principles as an organization was the danger of government intervention. The idea that, and if you look back at the founding documents of this country, the founders were deeply, deeply concerned about the government taking away the rights of the individual. And so, we really do want to limit that involvement. And that just gets exacerbated when we know that who the government gets involved with is very much a function of race, economic status, things that have nothing to do with culpability or the need actually for government intervention.
So how can people get involved in your work?
Ever since the 2016 election, I have been adamant that and many people, I'm not the only one saying this, and many people have heeded the call, but engagement in your local government is critical. Your school board, your town council, your city council, your planning board. This is where the decisions are made that have a huge impact on, day-to-day life for your schools, for your communities, for your policing. And so knowing how to engage in those communities is really important, and getting involved and following what people do. So that is my first ask of everybody, is to know your local government, know who you're voting for, know what people care about, know what your school board budget looks like. Great example. Does your school board budget include a police officer position? Our position is there is no reason to have a cop in a school. So, if that's something that you care about and you agree with us on, know in your budget if your school is doing that, and then start talking to your school board about why. Why do they think it's more important to have a cop rather than a social worker? So those kinds of local engagement are really important. We've started putting up resources, as well as lots of other great organizations in Maine, resources for more reading and more education about the moment we're in historically around trying to dismantle systemic racism and policing. So reading lists for anti-racist work, and that's on our website, and that more information will be forthcoming. We're also in the process of sort of giving some advocacy, creating more advocacy tools. Traditionally, we have advocacy tools that we put up during every legislative session that sort of help our members or people who are interested in the work. They can know what bills we're working on and how to write a letter to the editor, or how to write a letter to your representative. And so we are populating that now more and more with additional ways you can get involved in your municipal government. So our website is a good resource for that. Obviously, you can become a member. You can become a member of the ACLU, and we are one of those organizations that still does membership. You get a card. It's still true. You get an ACLU card for those of you old enough to remember being called a card-carrying member of the ACLU. I have mine. I encourage you to have yours. Many of us don't leave the house much anymore, but if you do, you can have it in your wallet, and everyone will know you're a member. So that's a really important way. And then joining our action, we have an email list that let you know what's happening around the state as we're working on issues. And so those are just a couple of the ways that people can get involved with us.
What do you see happening in the Bangor Blue Hill area?
Blue Hill has always been a phenomenal resource for sort of progressive movements and talking about equity and human worth and dignity. And so that has always been a community where ACLU has seen leadership coming out on issues, and lots of the coast, actually, for that matter. We see a lot of that. Bangor is interesting because I think we've also found there have been some of our most amazing ACLU volunteers have come out of the Bangor area. Just rock star, passionate, fiery, hardworking. In fact, one of our volunteers was so well known in the national organization that she was called by our national team Maine Mary, because she was so good and she was so engaged after the elections. So we see a lot of energy coming out of Bangor. I think, and I imagine you saw this reporting coming out of the Bangor Daily News in the last few days about the experience of kids of color at Bangor High School. And so I think that the challenges for communities of color outside of Portland or the Lewiston Auburn area, not that it is in any way easy in Portland, Lewiston, Auburn, but there is a larger percentage of population. And so that reporting was, there were students documenting the, horrific direct racial animus that they feel on a daily basis in their schools. Now, this wasn't a surprise, certainly to us at the ACLU, because a couple of years ago, we, thanks to the foundation in Maine, were able to commission a report called We Belong Here. That report was documented, we spoke with hundreds of students around the state, students of color, and it documented exactly what the students in Bangor were saying, which is, the experience of racial discrimination is everywhere, and it can go from the most hostile, outspoken, direct racial epithets, all the way to administrators who think they are being supportive, when in fact they're actually, reinforcing stereotypes or actually sort of diminishing the voice and power of students of color. And that there was a few schools that were doing, sort of making some headway, but generally speaking, the schools were in no way addressing the daily hostility that students of color feel. So I think, in the communities where there's even a smaller ratio of communities of color, it means it's even more, it's always incumbent on white community members to to sort of bear the brunt of that. This is not work that communities of color should have to do. But I think it is an opportunity for the non-Portland, Lewis and Auburn communities to really find a way to support their students of color. And we were very pleased to see that after that reporting, that the superintendent of the Bangor schools is sort of opening an investigation into what's happening to the students. I mean, and I guess I'd say on the one hand, I'm praising the superintendent for opening the investigation, but I would also say that historically investigations have not actually changed conversations. We've investigated police, police companies, agencies for years, decades. We've investigated schools, and, it's often just put on a shelf. So the real question is, will Bangor High School and every other high school in Maine, it's certainly not just Bangor, it's every single high school, will they do the hard work of figuring out what is happening in their communities and making sure that kids of color are not experiencing this daily assaults that are all around them in our culture.
So since 2016, I imagine there's been a lot of more community interest in your work. How has your organization ramped up or met this challenge?
In 2016, before the election, we had a very loyal, somewhat smaller membership. We had 1,700 members in the state of Maine. And since the election, we have, any time between 7,000 and 8,000 members who are part of our family. And that doesn't include all of the people who follow us on social media and actually engage in our actions. So it's even higher than that. And for Maine, that's a pretty hefty number of people. We've also grown organizationally. We were a staff of 8 people, and then we are currently a staff of 14. So we have grown to meet this challenge. I would give that all back, if some of the challenges we had faced and the communities weren't as devastated as they had been, and that the need for us was not as much as it has been. But, organizationally, I think we have been able to respond to the communities as they've called on us. I think we've been able to deepen our engagement in every level, both a community engagement program as well as our policy work is more robust, and our litigation is, we don't always sue, but when we do, we like to do it well. And so we've been able to increase we call it our docket, and really be able to bring cases that really make a difference in terms of setting government straight. Let's just call it that. For example, we're in a lawsuit against the state of Maine in relation to their policies on incarcerated folks in our Maine prisons. We, along with every other ACLU affiliate around the country, have been deeply dismayed by government's failure to sort of release people who are in prison who are, either highly vulnerable to COVID because of underlying existing conditions, and who are soon to be released. And so Maine, is not been taking action that we think is as urgent as they need to take. So that case is pending right now, and we bring those cases because we want to have a larger impact. That is an area where getting the courts involved is helpful, whichever way it goes down, but it is an ability for the government and the ACLU to try to figure out how they're going to respond to really an unprecedented challenge of a public health crisis in the prisons. We also look for places where, if we don't intervene in court, action will be taken that will be very disruptive. We might take a case, we took a case a few years ago, which is very important now in Maine, where a couple from Bar Harbor actually, was arrested for the wife videotaped a police officer conducting an arrest from across the street. She was well within her rights to do that. It's a fundamental right to protest. As our legal director likes to say, cops get to have guns, we get to have our cameras, and you get to use them. So our clients were arrested and booked in jail for videotaping the police. And we took that matter to court because it was really important. It was really important that we brought a challenge in the court saying this violates the First Amendment, and it's not acceptable. So, there are times when cases really need to get before a judge, and there's sometimes when the remedy would be so unwieldy that we're better off to build community and to try to make change that way.
How did you get started in this work?
I probably was literally born into it. When I was growing up, my mother worked for the ACLU. She was working in publishing, and coming out of college, and she was in her late 20s, and she got pregnant with me, her first child, and she went to her boss and told them with glee that she was pregnant, and they said, "That's fantastic, congratulations, you're fired." And so that was back in a time when women could be fired for being pregnant. And so she had no job, and she ended up volunteering at the ACLU of Massachusetts in their Worcester office. And so my early childhood was spent going to protests. Actually, it was in the early 70s in a protest for gay marriage in Worcester, Mass. So I have pictures of that. So I started that way. And then we lived in New York City, and she worked at the Women's Rights Project. So I probably I didn't have much of a chance. I was probably destined for this life of working for equality and justice. And so I then, continued with that. And then I felt, I was always interested in progressive issues and politics. One of my first bosses in life, I was a wide-eyed recent college grad and went to Washington D.C. thinking that politics was pure and you could make change. And I went there, and he told me, and I still think it's true today, but he told me back then in the early 90s that as a woman I would still face challenges to be taken seriously in different worlds, and that I should go and get a law degree. And so I took him seriously, and I ended up coming to Maine Law, and didn't know much about Maine before, but had heard that Maine Law was a really top-notch small public school. And I knew by that point I wasn't destined for a life of large salaries. And so I thought public school would make a lot of sense for me. So I came to Maine and went to law school, and then have continued in social justice since I graduated.
What are the biggest challenges or opportunities you see in Maine?
Probably one of the greatest opportunities is what made me want to stay is the connection between people. The way in which as a community we can come together, that people care about each other, they know about each other. There's not much of a degree of separation between people. You have access to your local officials in a way that doesn't exist in other states. And so I think it is that it's literally the people and the way we connect with each other. Greatest challenges might also be the people. It might be both sides. I mean, I think for far too long, many of us have, our worlds have been in certain bubbles and haven't necessarily connected with people with different experiences or different communities. And so we still have, a pretty segregated worldview in this state, even amongst progressives. And so I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure that, my neighbor's problems are my problems, or the person who has just, come here from fleeing persecution is coming here, that person's problems are my problems, or the young woman in Bangor who just graduated from, Bangor High School, young Black woman, that I care as much about her problems and that her world is as important in my world. So I think we, sometimes we do have a little bit of New England staying out of people's, sort of staying disconnected that way. So I think sometimes that can be a challenge. And I hope that with all of the conversation in the country right now, that this is an opportunity for white people to reach out beyond what have been traditionally their very closed circles, to really engage with other communities and to make all of those communities' challenges our challenges as well.
Who inspires you in Maine and beyond?
Ever since COVID, I mean, ACLU folks are not particularly good at work-life balance. It's sort of not, we struggle with that. So, and with COVID, we're all working a little bit more. So I hope it won't seem too cheesy, but I'd say the people who inspire me are the staff that I work with. The staff on our team are doing exceptional work every day, exhausted and invigorated, and they teach me every day. And they expand the way I think about the world. They expand the way that I think about civil rights. They're incredibly good at not accepting truths just because those are the truths that we have always had, just particularly as I've been doing this now for quite a while. So I'm inspired by our staff, very much. So, I mean, those are probably the people that are most, most directly in that. I think generally speaking, there's a group of Maine youth right now who are working to close Long Creek, Maine Youth Action. They're right now, I mean, I talk about them a ton. I'm so amazed to see what young people are doing to organize against systems of power to make change. And so I found a lot of inspiration in that. So this is probably more than you wanted, but there's so many people who are inspiring me right now. I've been working with a number of immigrant leaders around the COVID health disparities, and I am in awe of the passion and commitment and brilliance and in these community meetings and these communities of their commitment to both their community and to the community of Maine, their willingness to work at all hours and all days to try to make sure Maine people are safe. So that's been incredibly inspiring. So, I mean, there's, a lot of people, but it's a lot of people that are really on the ground day to day doing that work. Nationwide, it kind of comes back to what I was saying before. I mean, watching these young people protest and put their own lives, on the line has been incredibly affirming and really inspires me to, what we talked about when we started, that, that's the hope. That's the hope for the future when everything is looking a little gray right now, a little unclear. I'm really inspired by young people, by Movement for Black Lives, seeing more and more organizations led by impacted folks taking center stage and getting funding, which as an executive director you always care about. So watching that be able to happen is really exciting and inspiring.
You're listening to MaineQuality. I'm your host, Orion Breen, and with us today was Alison Beyea, Executive Director of ACLU Maine. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.